This lesson is going to be about using third-party plug-in filters as layers in your Photoshop document to get effects that other companies have created that are usually pretty cool. We're going to be using the Nik tools, and we're going to be using On1. There are many, many more companies out there that you can use that have plugins for Photoshop. Now, one thing you'll notice when I go into those tools, I'm going to be doing some things rather quickly, and I'm not going to be explaining them since this is a lesson about Photoshop and not about those tools. So as I said in the presentation, if you get some plugins and filters, you're going to have to spend some time to learn how they work so that you can put them in your workflow in Photoshop. And so I'll say what I'm doing, but I'm really not going to explain it very much. So let's take a look at this photo here. And again, I always check it out and see what I might want to do. First thing I see is I usually think of the cleanup. What might I have to fix on this photo before I go further with it? Unfortunately, I had some bokeh here right behind his head that is kind of distracting. I need to really get rid of that. And this here is a distracting bit too. I'll probably get rid of. Even though the background is blurred out, it's not blurred out sufficiently for me. I use a Canon 100 to 400 with a teleconverter on it, so it means that the largest f-stop I can have is 8.0, so sometimes it doesn't blur it out, and so I use the Nik tools to help me out on that. Plus, I'm going to want to get some detail and lighten up this head some, so we're going to do that also using the Nik tools. So let's start with the cleanup layer first. I'm just create a blank layer here, and let me name it cleanup. Okay, and for here I think I'm going to use the clone stamp tool, and we'll grab that from over here, and I'm just going to use the area nearby to clone that out. So how the clone stamp tool works, you press down Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac and say this is the area I want to copy from, and let's see if we can get rid of that. I'm doing this fairly quickly. If this was really doing it for my own work, I'd be a little more careful. Okay, that's good enough. And then to get rid of this, I think what I'm going to do is use the healing brush tool. Works sort of like the clone stamp, and you've got to find an area that you want to copy from. So I want to, I think, copy from up here. Again, hold down Alt or Option, click there once, and we can bring that over and copy that area in. So that looks better. Now if we look here, we'll take the visibility off of our background. You can see what happened. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is go into my Nik tools and do something about this background. See if I can smooth it out a little bit. So I'm going to go to Filters, and since it's a plugin, it shows my Nik collection here, and I'm going to go to the Color FX Pro tool. But something is going to happen that you probably won't expect. And it's going to be a good lesson about copying layers. Okay, well, we didn't get the photo. We only got that last layer. So let's cancel out of that. And if you see that, you say, hey, what's going on? Well, Nik is grabbing this layer and saying I'm going to operate on it, and that's not really what we want Nik to look at. We have to create a layer that is a combination, and we talked about that in our first lesson about copying. So I'm going to use Shift Control Alt or Shift Command Option and the letter E, And I created a layer that combined these two layers into one. Now, with that active, let me go over to Filters, Nik Collection, and try it again for our Color Effects Pro. So as it copies all the information into the Color Effects tool, and there we go. That looks much, much better. What you can see is on the left there's a bunch of filters. The filters that I use for smoothing out backgrounds is the tonal contrast softening. Okay, and you can see that it softened the background. If we take this on and off, you can see it's nicely soft, but it also softened the main subject here, and I don't want it to do that, so it happens in Nik. I don't have to really paint it out. Nik has an option to do that. It's called control points. I'm going to grab this control point, put it here, and this is what they call a negative control point. So what it is basically painting out the softening effect on the head of the turtle. So if we look at it, we're getting the soft background like we had maybe a 2.8 lens on instead. So I'm going to add that filter to my stack, and let's go back, and I want to get some more detail out of that head. So it has something called Detail Extractor. Let me add that filter. And you can see it's sort of light in the head, and we get a lot more contrast out of it, but it's also kind of destroyed what we did in softening the background because it brought detail up for everything. So again, I'm going to get one of these control points, but instead of a negative control point, I'm going to get a plus control point and put it on this head. Okay. So what I get now, if I do that, you can see I brought some more detail in. I'm getting some part of the background, so let me just change that. Okay. It looks pretty good. I can also change the amount of the effect here. I think I'm going to bring that down a little bit. There we go. Okay, so that's so what we've done so far is we've softened the background. We've gotten a little more detail back in the head. So let me add that filter. Another thing that I want to do is a vignette. To do that, Nik Color Effects Pro has a great filter called Dark and Lighten Center. So that's what I'm going to use for my vignette. First thing I want to do is tell it where the center is, because it puts it directly in the center. And so you can place the center, and you can move that around wherever it looks best for what you're trying to highlight. And let's do it right there. Also, we can create a darker border, and let's do that. Let's just darken it a bit because I really want the head to pop out. Okay. Add my filter stack. So I've got it looking pretty good. I'm still going to do a few more things, but let's go ahead and add that as a layer to Photoshop, and just go down here and say OK. Okay, it's processing the filter now and adding all the effects. You'll see it in a moment here. Okay, so now we can see the result of what we just did. So let's click this off and on. You can see we basically relighted the turtle and softened the background a bit. Now, before we proceed though, this layer here that we created, that was the sum of these, really doesn't do us any good. We can click it on and off. It was just so Nick could grab it and have all the information it needed to process. So we can delete that layer. And you'll find that as you're working with different tools, sometimes a layer is useful as an intermediate step, but then after the information is done, which is baked in here, we can go ahead and delete that. So we'll delete that like that. And we haven't lost a thing. Alright, so one other thing that I want to do is use a different tool. One tool that I like is On1. And On1 has a couple of features, and I really like its dynamic contrast that it uses. And I would like to put that on the head of the tortoise here. So let me activate that. And there are two ways you can do it, and this is part of learning what your plugins, how they work. You could go to On1 here, and I could do what is called On1 effects and bring it up. What it will do though is it will put the effect on this layer, on the same layer, and I don't want it to do that. I want my layers to be separated. So the way On1 works is if you go down to the Automate menu under File, you'll also see the On1 filters. So I'm going to execute On1 effects from here, and you can see that it's looking at layers already, and so it's going to bring up the photo in their own effects panel. And I had already used dynamic contrast. The last filter I used, I can show you that there's a list of filters here. Again, we're not going to go over how On1 works, and there's a learning curve to all plugins. So let's go back to the dynamic contrast, and they have several presets, and I like using the natural preset. But again, it's putting the effect on the entire photo. On1 has its own masking, just like Photoshop does. But since this is a Photoshop class, what I'm going to do, it could be done either way. I could go ahead and mask in just the effect on the tortoise's head in here, but you really don't want to see what On1 does. We want to see how Photoshop works. So let me just hit done here with that feature. Okay, and we're back to Photoshop. You can see we have the On1 Photo Raw effect. Here was the Color Effects Pro. If we turn that on and off, you can see we're getting that dynamic contrast through the entire photo. So we just go back to normal masking. We'll go down to our add a new mask, except we're going to hold down the Alt on PC or Option on the Mac and create us a black mask, which gets rid of the effect everywhere. And so we're going to paint it back in just on the head of the tortoise. So we'll pick up our paintbrush. We'll make sure that our foreground color is white and that our mask is selected. And using the bracket keys, we can change the size of our paintbrush. Make sure the paintbrush is at a hardness of 0 so that it's a very soft brush. And using our quick mask, which is backslash, let's paint in this effect where we want it. It's just another way of drawing attention to the part of the photo that you want. So you need to pick where it would best look. So I'm going to do it just a little bit down the neck of the tortoise. Alright, let's get our quick mask off, and now let's look at it. Okay. So you can see that effect, and we'll look at the mask real quick. I always look at the mask because even with the quick mask, sometimes I miss spots and they're obvious on the mask, and so I just go in and touch those up, and you hit the photo again, and there we are. Okay, one more thing. It's looking better, the head's a little brighter, but I still don't think it's bright enough. So I'm going to go back to the Nik tools, and there is one called Viveza, which uses control points to basically, you can relight and do all kinds of effects on parts of the photo without doing elaborate masking. But what we need to do before we just say start Nik tools is see what's going to happen here. We masked out the layer below so that we could just mask in the effect, the on-one dynamic contrast effect here. Let's see if I turn this layer off, what would happen. Okay, we lose the effect that we did here in Nik. And what's going to happen, Nik is going to look at this layer, and it's going to use this mask, and so most of the effect would be masked out. So when you tried to use the Nik Viveza tool, it would revert, and you'd say, what happened? And that was a lesson I had to learn when first starting using these third-party tools. I had to really look at what was on my layer. So what we need to do is another merge visible, so we can get a composite layer, a layer with all those effects baked in that Nik can grab. So we can turn off these, and we can use our Shift Alt or a Shift Control Alt or Shift Command option on the Mac and E, and create a new intermediate layer that baked in all of these effects. Now we can go over to Nik and grab Viveza. We can hit F to get full screen. We're going to grab a control point, and we're going to put it on the head of our tortoise. We're going to look at what kind of mask it's creating. Again, I'm not going to get into exactly what it's doing, but you can see the light parts are what is going to have the effects, and the dark parts are what's not going to have the effect. And then we can increase the brightness on the head of the tortoise right here. Take a look at what we've done without a lot of masking. We're done. You hit OK. Nik's going to do its thing. Copy the image and the effect over as a layer. Okay. You can see right there how we've brightened it. But again, we do not need this layer anymore. We can delete it. Okay. That, just to remind you where we started, let's take this off. This is where we started. And by building up our layers, this is where we ended up.